Chapter 36. Nevitt, wake up! Nevitt came awake in an instant, his hand closing automatically on the blaster hidden beneath his pillow. His eyes snapped open, taking in the scene with a single glance. Cliff standing in the bedroom doorway, a blaster in his hand and a furious expression on his face, barely visible in the dim light of Drevstar Darn streaming through the window. What? He snapped. Someone's been in the shop, Cliff snarled. Throw on some clothes and come on. Someone had been in the shop, all right. Nevitt walked through the store in a stunned daze, crunching data cards and bits of random equipment underfoot, staring in disbelief at the carnage that had been visited on their neat little pet emporium. I don't believe this, Cliff muttered for about the fifth time. I do not believe this. How in space did she get in without tripping the alarms? I don't know, Nevitt said, glancing over one of the rows of cages. At least she didn't take the Mockrans. Near as I can tell, she didn't actually take anything, Cliff growled, looking around. Just quietly took everything apart and rearranged it. Nevitt nodded. Yet for all her energy and enthusiasm, it looked as if she'd missed the real prize. The section of back wall beside the power coupling box, where he and Cliff had installed their hidden storage compartment, seemed to be untouched. Well, aside from making a mess, she hasn't really done anything, he said, circling around the sales counter. The computer was on. She must have gone in and poked through their files. A waste of her time there, too. Nevitt! He looked up. Cliff was standing at the Prompus cage, gazing down on the shelf beside it. What? Nevitt asked, rounding the counter again and joining him. Lying on the shelf, laid out in neat rows, were the tiny cylinders that had been hidden in the false bottom of the Mokren cage. And sitting next to them was another binary-linked comlink. You gonna talk to her? Cliff prompted. And do what? Nevitt retorted. Listen to her gloat some more? Maybe you can get her to tell you what she's going to do next. Cliff gestured to the cylinders. One of them is missing. Nevitt swallowed a curse. Picking up the comlink, he thumbed it on. You've been a busy little girl, haven't you? He ground out. Why, good morning, the old woman's voice came back. Didn't she ever sleep? You're up early. You're up late, Nevitt countered. And you ought to take better care of yourself. Unaccustomed exercise could be fatal in someone your age. Oh, pish, she scoffed. A little exercise keeps the old heart running smoothly. Until you run it up against a sharp object, Nevitt reminded her darkly. There are laws on Bothawui against vandalism, you know. Only if you know who to deliver the warrant against, she said airily. And you don't, do you? Nevitt ground his teeth together. She was right. All their efforts to back-check her ship ID had come up completely dry. Then I guess we'll just have to deal with you ourselves, he said. There was a clucking sound. I suggested that last night. I do wish you'd make up your minds. Did you fetch your Zeril Night Stinger, by the way? Nevitt smiled tightly. He'd fetched it all right. It was sitting right there across the room in their hidden storage compartment, ready to go. What exactly did you think you would find in here, anyway? Oh, you never know, she said. I've always liked animals, you know. What are all those little cylinders for? You're the expert on everything. You figure it out. My, but you're crabby first thing in the morning, she chided. Not even a hint? I'll trade you, Navin offered. Why don't you tell me what you're planning next? Me? She asked, all wide-eyed innocence. Why, nothing. From this point on, it's up to the Bothans. Navit shot a look at Cliff. Of course it is, he said. Come on now. You can't call security in on this, and we both know it. It's just you and us. You go ahead and believe that, she said encouragingly. Well, I'm a little tired, and you've got company coming. Talk to you later. The transmission shut off with a click. Goodbye to you too, Navit muttered, turning off the comlink and setting it down on the shelf. Pulling his knife, he deliberately drove it through the device. What did she mean about company? Cliff asked suspiciously as Navitt brushed the pieces of the comlink into the waste collector. You don't suppose she has called security, do you? Not a chance, Navitt said. Come on, we've got to get this place straightened up before opening time. He broke off as across the shop there was a knock at the door. Frowning, he crossed the room, returning knife and blaster to their hiding places in his tunic. Unlocking the door, he pulled it open, to find himself face to face with a group of four Bothans wearing the wide green and yellow shoulder sashes of local police. Proprietor Navitt of the Exoticalia Pet Emporium, the one in front asked. Yes, Navitt confirmed. Shop hours are. I'm Investigator Proyskin of the Dreftstarn Department of Criminal Discouragement, the Bothan interrupted briskly, holding up a shimmering ID. We received word that you had had a break-in. His eyes flicked over Navitt's shoulder. Obviously, the report was accurate. May we come in? Of course, Navitt said, stepping back to let them enter, trying to keep his suddenly murderous thoughts out of his voice. No, the old woman hadn't done anything so obvious as calling security. Not her. I was just about to call you, actually, he added as the Bothans fanned out across the shop. We only just discovered it ourselves. You have a list of inventory in stock, Proyskin called back over his shoulder. I'll get it for you, Cliff volunteered, heading off towards the computer. One of the Bothans had paused beside the Prompus cage. Proprietor, he called. What are these cylinders? He reached down. Please, be careful with those, Navitt said quickly, hurrying to his side, mind furiously casting about for something that would sound reasonable. They're hormonal drip capsules for our baby Mockrens. What sort of hormones are required? The Bothan asked. Newborn Mockrens need a particular combination of solar spectrum, atmospheric conditions, and diet, Cliff put in, picking up on Navitt's cue and running with it as only Cliff could do. You can almost never get the right mixture off their own world, so you use a hormonal drip. That's them over there, Navitt added, pointing to the cage with the tiny lizards. We fasten the cylinders onto their backs with custom-designed harnesses. I see, the Bothan said, peering at them. When will this need to be done? This morning, actually, Cliff said. Sorry, but you'll have to look around on your own for a while, Investigator Proyskin, if you don't mind. Of course, Proyskin said. Please, carry on. Navitt stepped over to one of the overturned tables, hiding a grimly satisfied smile as he set it upright again. So much for the old woman's attempt at subtlety. Clearly he and Cliff could outsubtle her any day of the week. Not only did they now have reason to postpone long official questions, not only had they soothed any possible suspicion by offering the investigators the run of the place, but they would even be setting up the final phase of their plan right under the collective nose for a Bothan officialdom. Of course, they hadn't planned to institute that particular phase for a couple of days yet, but you couldn't have everything. Setting up the restraint grid, ignoring the quietly bustling Bothans wandering around looking for clues, they set to work. They had finished fitting 97 of the Mockrens with harnesses and cylinders, with about 20 more to go, when Navitt first became aware of the new odor wafting through the shop. He looked up at Cliff, engrossed in attaching one of the cylinders onto the back of the tiny lizard standing in rigid immobility on the restraint grid, then let his gaze shift around the shop. The four original Bothan investigators had long since left, replaced by a group of three techs busily pulling handprints and chemical samples from the various counters and cages. None of them seemed to have noticed the smell. Cliff looked up, caught the expression on Navitt's face. Trouble? He murmured. Navitt wrinkled his nose. Cliff frowned, sniffing the air, and suddenly his eyes widened. Smoke. Navitt nodded fractionally, his eyes darting again around the shop. Nothing was visible, no flames and no smoke, but the smell was definitely getting stronger. She wouldn't, Cliff hissed. Would she? We'd better assume she would, Navitt said. Take the Mockrens we've finished and get them over to the Tap Cafe. Now? Cliff glanced at the bright sunshine outside the window. Navitt, there's a full staff at work there right now. Then you'd better come up with a really dandy diversion to get them out of the way, Navitt shot back. If they lost the Mockrens, this whole thing would have been for nothing. Wake up Penson and Horvik. We're in full emergency mode here. Cliff nodded grimly. Got it, he said. Setting his tools aside, he started putting the last few mock wrens back into the cage. And suddenly one of the Bothans let out a squawk. Fire! He bleated. The building is on fire! More of y'all! Call the extinguishers! Hurry! Fire? Navid asked, looking around in feigned bewilderment. Where? I don't see any fire. Foolish human, the Bothan snapped. Can't you smell the smoke? Hurry! Leave everything and go! Navid shot a glare at Cliff. So that was the old woman's plan. She couldn't figure out what on the shop their scheme needed, so she was going to force them to leave without any of it. But my stock is very valuable, he protested. As valuable as your life? The Bothan, ignoring his own advice, was moving rapidly around the outer edge of the shop, hands brushing along the walls. Go! Get out! What are you doing? Cliff asked. You're right, there's no flame yet, the Bothan explained. The fire must therefore be inside the walls. The extinguishers are coming, one of the other Bothans reported anxiously, waving his comlink. But they will not be here for a few more minutes. Understood, the first said, pausing at the power coupling box. Abruptly, his fur flattened, and he pulled a knife from his belt. Perhaps we can help prepare their way. Wait a minute, Navid barked, jumping forward. The Bothan had dug the knife between the wall's panels directly over their hidden compartment. What the fracas are you doing? The fire smells of wiring, the Bothan explained breathlessly. Here at the power coupling is the likely place for it to be. If we can expose it and bring fire preventers to bear. He broke off, staggering as the prying knife unexpectedly shattered through the relatively thin false front of the storage compartment. He caught his balance, gaping at the Night Stinger's sniper blaster now visible inside. Proprietor Navid, he exclaimed. What is this weapon? He fell to the floor, question unfinished, as Navid shot him in the back. The second Bothan got out just a squeak before Navid's second shot dropped him. The third was fumbling frantically for both comlink and blaster when Cliff's shot took him out. Well, that's torrid, Cliff snarled, glaring at Navid. What in the Empire? She's expecting us to be properly professional about this, Navid ground out, and professionals never start shooting unless they have to. So fine, we've just gone unprofessional. That ought to take her by surprise. Oh, terrific, Cliff said. A brilliantly unorthodox strategy. Now what do we do? We take it down, that's what, Navid snarled back, thrusting his blaster back into his tunic and stepping over to the body to pull the Night Stinger from its hiding place. Rouse Penson and Horvik and get your tails out to the ship and into space. You've got 2 hours, maybe less, to get aboard the Predominance and into position. Night Stinger in hand, he turned back to find a stunned look on Cliff's face. Navid, we can't do it now, he protested. The attack force won't be ready for another 3 days. You want to try to dodge our lady friend that long? Navid snapped, dropping the Night Stinger onto the table and starting to scoop the rest of the mock wrens into their cage. You can see her plan. She's trying to maneuver the police or extinguishers or Vader knows who else in a uniform into running interference against us for her. We have to move now, when she's not expecting it. But the attack force! Stop worrying about the attack force, Navid cut him off. They'll be ready, all right. Or we'll get that way blasted quick. You have your orders. All right, Cliff said, sliding his own weapon away. I'll leave you the land speeder. I can lift another one for the 3 of us. Anything else you need? Nothing I can't get myself, Navid told him shortly. Go on. The chrono's counting. Right. Good luck. He left. Navid finished getting the mock wrens into their cage, then gathered up the rest of the cylinders and slid them back into the cage's false bottom. Yes, the old woman had forced his hand, and that sudden drastic change in plans was going to cost them dearly. But if she thought she'd won, she was mistaken. He only wished he could be around to see her when she realized that. I'm sure you understand, Admiral, Paloma Dasami said, obviously picking her words very carefully, how unprecedented this step would be for our people. We have never before had what might be considered close relations with the Empire. Seated a quarter of the way around the table, Disra suppressed a cynical smile. Paloma Dasema, one of the proud and exalted 11 of the Mistral, might well think herself subtle, even clever, in the ways of politics and political sparring. But to him, She was as patently transparent as only a rank amateur could be. If this was the best the Mistral could do, he would have them eating out of his hand before the day was over. Or rather, eating out of Grand Admiral Thrawn's hand. I understand the conflicts we've had in the past, Thrawn said gravely. However, as I've pointed out to you, and to Carolee Dulin before you, he added, nodding politely to the younger woman at Decima's side, the Empire under my leadership will bear little resemblance to that of the late Emperor Palpatine. I understand that, the older woman said. Her face wasn't giving anything away. Her hands, though, more than made up for it. I only bring it up to remind you that we would need more than just your word as guarantee. Are you questioning the word of Grand Admiral Thrawn? Disra asked, letting just a hint of an edge into his voice. The gambit worked. Decima was instantly on the defensive. Not at all, she assured him, too quickly. It's merely that she was saved by a signal from the conference room intercom. Admiral Thrawn, this is Captain Dorja, the familiar voice said. Seated at Thrawn's side, Tierce touched the switch. This is Major Tierce, Captain, he said. The Admiral is listening. Forgive the interruption, sir, Dorja said, but you asked to be informed immediately if any unscheduled ships approached the base. They've just received a transmission from the Imperial Star Destroyer Tyrannic, requesting emergency assistance. Disra threw a startled look at Tierce. The Tyrannic was one of the 3 ships lurking behind their cloaking shields off Bothawui, or at least it was supposed to be there. Did they specify the nature of their emergency? Thrawn asked. Coming through now, sir. They say they've come under attack by a sizable New Republic assault force and have been severely damaged. They say the force is right behind them and that they need shelter. General Hestive is requesting instructions. Disra felt a tight smile crease his lips. No, of course it wasn't the real Tyrannic out there. Tierce's hunch had been right. Coruscant had indeed launched a mad attempt to steal a copy of the Kamas document. And not only was the trap ready and waiting, they even had one of the Mistral's 11 here to watch that pitiful attempt turned into a humiliating defeat. The real Thrawn couldn't have arranged things better. Instruct General Hestive to let the incoming Star Destroyer pass the outer perimeter, Thrawn told Dorja. He's then to put all defenses on full battle readiness and prepare for enemy attack. Yes, sir. And then, Captain, Thrawn added, you will similarly prepare the Relentless for combat. Track the incoming Star Destroyer as it approaches and plot its course, then bring us to stand directly between it and the base. At that point, you will order General Hestive to bring full inner defenses to bear on it. Yes, sir, Dorja said, sounding slightly puzzled, but nevertheless unquestioning. Will you be coming to the bridge? Of course, Captain. Thrawn stood up, favoring Decima with a slight smile as he gestured her towards the conference room door. In fact, I believe we all will. The sudden noise snapped Ghent out of his doze and sent him jerking upright in his chair. He looked around the work area wildly, saw he was still alone. Only then did his sleep-fogged mind realize the sound was some kind of alarm. He looked around the room again, searching for the source of the trouble. There was nothing he could see. Obviously, it must be elsewhere in the station. A moment's search in the climate-controlled section of the board, and he found the cutoff switch. The sound faded away into an unpleasant ringing in his ears. For another moment he looked at the board, wondering if it would be worth trying to tap into the main comm system and find out what was going on. Probably not. Whatever it was, it probably didn't have anything to do with him. He frowned suddenly. The board in front of him seemed to be flickering. Flickering? The frown vanished into relieved understanding. Of course. He was getting reflections of light coming in through the viewport in the living area behind him. Getting to his feet, wincing as his knees informed him he'd been sitting in one place too long again, he hobbled in through the open door and peered out the viewport. The source of the flickering light was instantly apparent. An awesome display of multiple turbolaser and proton torpedo blasts coming from the distance near the base's outer defense perimeter. And framed in the center of all that flashing firepower, bearing inexorably straight down on him, was the huge bulk of an Imperial Star Destroyer. Ghent caught his breath, staring at the incoming ship. Suddenly, all of Pelian's and Hestive's talk about danger and threats, tucked snugly away in the back of his mind for the past few days, came rushing to the forefront again. That Star Destroyer was coming for him. He was sure of it. Run! The thought flashed into his mind. Run out of here, down the long tunnel into the main base. Find General Hestive or that TIE pilot who brought him here from the Chimera, or just find somewhere to hide. But no, Hestive had warned him about spies inside the main base. If he went there, one of them would surely get him. And besides, he remembered suddenly, he couldn't go anywhere. He'd triple sealed the single access door, passwording it with a layer of computer locks that would take an enemy hours to slice through. Even he, who'd set up the blocks in the first place, would probably need half an hour to undo them. And half an hour would be too late. Far too late. For another minute, he watched the incoming ship, wondering distantly what they would do to him. Then, with a sigh, he turned away. He was trapped here. They were coming for him, and there was nothing he could do. Returning to the work area, this time closing the door behind him, he went back to his seat. The Wickstrom K-220s had finally finished the complex analysis he'd set for them to do before all of this happened. Keying the results over to the Master Line 70, pushing the events outside once again into the back of his mind, he got back to work. Pardon me. It took Navid half an hour to locate and purchase the pressurized tank of flammable liquid that he needed, and another 15 minutes to fit it with a sprayer hose. 45 minutes gone, during which time the alarm over the dead Bothans in the pet shop had probably spread to every corner of the city. But that was all right. The ugly furry aliens couldn't stop him now, and the more time it took him to get ready here on the planetary surface, the more time Cliff and Penson and Horvik would have to wheedle their way aboard the Ashori ship overhead. They would die there, of course. They knew that. But then, he would soon be dying down here, too. What was important was that, before they died, they would complete their task. The streets around the Hodin Tap Cafe, so quiet and deserted in the late night, were buzzing with activity here in the early afternoon. With the fluid tank pressed into the seat beside him, wedged at an awkward angle against the low roof, Navitt drove slowly down the deserted alleys along the sides and back of the Tap Cafe, systemically spraying a thick layer of the liquid along the lower walls and the ground around them. The front wall, facing as it did onto a busy street, was too public for him to do the same there without arousing instant suspicion. But he had other plans for that area anyway. Returning to the back alley, again making sure he was unobserved, he fired a blaster bolt into the fluid as he drove past the Tap Cafe. He took his time circling through the alleyways until he came around again onto the main street, with the result that by the time he let the land speeder coast to a stop across from the Tap Cafe, the fire he'd started was blazing furiously away along the outer walls. Pedestrians were running frantically to and fro, waving and yelling as they either fled from the flames or formed themselves into ghoulish knots at a safe distance to watch. And as Navitt retrieved the night stinger from the back seat, the Tap Cafe's front doors swung open and a crowd of equally hysterical customers and waitstaff began streaming out through the smoke. Checking the night stinger's indicator, confirming that he still had 3 shots left, Navitt settled down to wait. He didn't have to wait very long. The stream of refugees from the Tap Cafe had barely begun to dwindle when a white extinguisher speeder's truck came roaring around the corner and braked to a hard stop at one corner of the building. Through the side window, Navitt could see the driver gesticulating as his partner scrambled out and started climbing the outside ladder towards the pressure turret on top. He never made it. Resting the muzzle of the night stinger on the seat back for stability, Navitt shot him down. His second invisible blast took out the driver. His third and last blew off the speeder truck's filler tube cap, sending the fire suppressant gushing onto the street to flow uselessly away from the flames. He lowered the now empty blaster onto the floor, giving the crowd around him a quick look. But no one was paying the slightest attention to the human sitting alone in his land speeder. Every eye was locked solidly on the blazing building, which probably only an occasional brief thought turned to the puzzle of the 2 Bothan extinguishers, who had suddenly and inexplicably collapsed. The flow of customers from the Tap Cafe had stopped now. Navitt gave it 30 more seconds just to make sure everyone was out. Then, drawing his blaster and laying it ready on the seat beside him, Started the land speeder and eased his way through the crowd towards the Tap Cafe's front doors. He was through the main part of the crowd before anyone even seemed to notice what he was doing. Someone shouted, and a Bothan wearing the green yellow police sash jumped out in front of him, waving his arms violently. Snatching up his blaster, Navit shot him, veered around the body, and leaned hard on the accelerator. Someone behind him was screaming now. Bracing himself, Navit increased his speed. He hit the Tap Cafe doors with bone-jarring force, smashing them into shards as the land speeder ground to a halt right in the middle of the destruction. He was out before the debris finished bouncing off the vehicle's roof, snatching the cage of mock wrens from the back and sprinting through the smoke and heat towards the door of the basement and the sub-basement beyond it. He was halfway down the first flight of stairs when behind him he heard the explosion as the heat set off the remaining fluid of the pressurized tank he'd left in the land speeder. And with the front of the Tap Cafe now as engulfed in flames as the rest of the building, he was truly and irrevocably cut off from the outside world. No one in the universe could stop him now. There was just a hint of smoke in the sub-basement. Nothing serious, just a foreshadowing of what would inevitably come. Their equipment was just where they'd left it, but he took a minute first to run a quick check on the fusion disintegrator. It was a good thing he had. The old woman had been here again, gimmicking the device to overload and burn out the main control coil when it was first started. Grinning humorlessly to himself, Navadin gimmicked it, and then spent a few more precious minutes reconfiguring the focus to extend the disintegration beam a few centimeters out from the canister mouth. Finally, he was ready. Strapping the mock wren cage awkwardly to his back, he dropped into the hole he and Cliff had dug and turned on the disintegrator. The beam cut through the soil beneath his feet like a blaster bolt through snow, sending a gale of microscopic dust flowing up past his face. Fleetingly, he wished he'd thought to bring a filter mask with him. Too late now. Squinting against the eye-burning wind, he kept going, wondering what the Bothans were doing about the myriad of alarms he was undoubtedly setting off. Running around uselessly, no doubt, particularly once they saw that the source of the intrusion was totally inaccessible to them. And some of them would probably sit back and relax, smugly secure in the knowledge that losing the power conduit he was digging towards wouldn't affect their precious shield in the slightest. Possibly they were even having a hearty laugh at the foolish Imperial agent who thought he could shut them down so easily, or who perhaps thought he could crawl through a 10-centimeter diameter conduit. They wouldn't be laughing that way for long. It took only a few minutes to dig the rest of the way down to the power conduit. The conduit shell was heavily armored, and it took nearly 10 minutes more for the disintegrator beam to eat its way through. The power cables themselves flash burned almost instantly once that happened, of course. They were, after all, only normal power cables, not designed to withstand anything more strenuous than high-power electrical current. He kept at it until he had carved himself a decently sized hole in the outer shell, then shut off the disintegrator and switched on the coolant pack built into the bottom. A few minutes of systematic spraying, and the area was once again cool enough to touch. He shut off the coolant and sat down by the opening, and in the sudden silence, he heard a quiet new sound. The beep of a comlink, coming from the disintegrator. He frowned, checking the device. There it was, wedged into the refill intake for the coolant pack. Smiling tightly, he pulled it out and turned it on. "Hello there," he said. "Everything running to your satisfaction?" "What in the name of Alderaan dust are you doing?" the old woman's voice demanded. He smiled more broadly, wedging the comlink into his collar and opening the mock wren's cage's false bottom. "What's the matter?" he asked, pulling out a small tube of food paste. "I didn't actually take you by surprise or anything, did I? That was a cute trick with the smoke at the pet shop, by the way. I take it you planted that before you left this morning?" "Yes," she said. "I figured you had all your good stuff upstairs with you, or else had it hidden behind walls or ceilings." "So you planted the delayed action smoke bomb so the extinguishers would come in and open up the walls for you," Navit said, opening the cage and extracting one of the tiny lizards. "Very clever." "Look, you haven't got time for this chit-chat," she growled. "In case you haven't noticed, that building is burning like a torch over your head." "Oh, I know," Navit said. Holding the lizard with one hand, he dabbed a drop of the food paste onto the end of its nose and set it down into the hole he'd cut, pointing it in the direction of the generator building. A touch on one end of the cylindrical bomb activated it, setting it to explode when the lizard reached the blockage where the conduit passed through the reinforced wall and sent its individual power cables splitting off into a dozen different directions. He released his grip, and the Mokren scrambled away through the narrow space between the power cables and the conduit shell, following the scent it was too stupid to realize was attached to its own nose. What do you mean, you know? The woman asked. Unless you do something real clever real fast, you're going to die in there. You know that too? We all have to die sometime, Navitt reminded her, dabbing the nose of another Mokren and sending it to follow the first. It had barely vanished down the conduit when the faint sound of a small explosion echoed down the tube. There was nothing wrong with the old woman's ears. What was that? She asked. The death of Bothawui, Navitt told her, dabbing another Mokren and releasing it as a second explosion sounded. Now that the fumes of disintegrated dirt were dissipating, he could tell that the odor of smoke was getting stronger. You know, we never did figure out what your name was, he added, pulling out another Mokren and wondering uneasily just how fast the fire above him was spreading. If either the flame or smoke got to him before the Mokrens and their tiny bombs were able to blow a hole through the group of unarmored power cables just inside the generator building, he could still lose. So what is it? What, my name? She asked. You tell me yours and I'll tell you mine. Sorry, he said, releasing the Mokrens. My name might still be of use to someone down the line, even after I myself no longer am. There was another explosion. And then, to his relief and immense satisfaction, a breath of cool air drifted up into his face. The power cables had been blown apart inside the wall, and the generator building had been laid open to him. Look, Imperial. Conversation's over. Navitt cut her off. Enjoy the fire. He clicked off the comlink and tossed it aside. Then he tipped the cage over, allowing the rest of the Mokrens to swarm free. For a moment they swirled around his lap and feet, getting their balance and sniffing the air. Then, in a sudden concerted rush, they clawed their way past each other to disappear down the conduit. Drawn now not by food paste on their noses, but by the tiny spots of liquid nutrient he and Cliff had so carefully positioned 3 days ago as they'd sprayed for metal mites. And there remained just one final task for him to perform. Reaching into the bottom of the cage, he pulled out the last item there, the remote arming signaler to activate the rest of the cylinders now being carried towards their rendezvous with Destiny. A few more seconds and his self-guided bombs would be spilling out into the generator building around the startled Bothan's feet, skittering across the polished floor straight to the key points of the whole installation. Along the conduit, he could hear the faint sounds of explosions now as the Mokrens reached their targets and the cylinder's proximity fuses began to ignite. A few more seconds, a minute at the most, and the section of the planetary shield protecting Drevstarn would collapse. The death of Bothawui had begun, and with it, the death of the New Republic. His only regret was that he wouldn't be around to see it all happen. Overhead, the sounds of flames could be heard now, the crackling noise mixing with the fainter staccato of the bombs still glowing off in the distance. Smiling up at the ceiling, Navitt leaned his back against the dirt wall and waited for the end. The discussions aboard the Predominance had just entered their fourth round when the deck below them gave a sudden rumbling vibration, a sound and sensation that Leia had become all too familiar with over the years. Somewhere in the depths of the Ashori ship, a turbolaser cluster had just fired. The captain was on the intercom even before the rumble had died away. "What is the firing?" he snarled. The answer tumbled out in Ashori, too fast and too faint for Leia to follow. "What is happening?" Gavresom demanded. "You agreed there would be no hostilities while—" "It is not us," the captain snarled, diving for the door. "Aliens have taken over one of our weapons clusters and are firing at the ground." "What?" Gavresom asked, blinking. "But how?" But the captain was already gone, taking the door guards with him. "Counselor Organa Solo," Gavresom began, breaking off as another rumble rolled through the ship. "Counselor, what is happening here?" Leia shook her head. "I don't—" And suddenly she jerked in her seat, inhaling sharply as a surge of fear and pain and death shot through her. On the planet below, voices were crying out in terror, and in that single horrifying instant, she knew what had happened. The planetary shield's down, she snapped, getting out of her chair and rushing to the viewport. She reached it just in time to see a third massive turbolaser blast burn its way from the underside of the ship towards the surface. There was a flash of white as it sizzled through the atmosphere, and then the distortion cleared, leaving an angry, black-tinged red glow behind. Drevstarn, the Bothan capital, was on fire. She turned back, heading for the door. "It's down, all right," she shouted to Gaversom as she ran past him. "At least over Drevstarn." "Where are you going?" Gaversom called after her. "To try to stop the shooting," Leia called back. Outside, a dozen armor-clad Ashori were charging down the corridor, blaster carbines at the ready. Pressed against the bulkhead, trying to stay out of the way, her two Nagri guards looked up at her. "Counselor!" "Come on," Leia told them. Unhooking her lightsaber from her belt, stretching out to the Force for strength and wisdom, she joined in with the flow. Han hit the Falcon's cockpit at a full run, skidding to a halt just barely in front of the control board. "Where?" he barked, dropping into the pilot seat. "There," Elagos said tightly, pointing through the viewport at the dark ship lying in space, not 2 kilometers away. "I don't know whose ship it is, but—" He broke off as another flash of red fire cut through the black of space on its way towards the planet below. "There! Did you see it?" "Oh, yeah, I saw it," Han snarled, a hard jab of fear punching up under his heart as he slapped at the emergency startup switches. Elagos might have lost track of which ship was which out there, but he hadn't. The shot had come from the flagship of the Ashori Task Force, the war cruiser Predominance. The ship Leia was currently aboard. There was another flash, again heading down towards the Bothawui surface. "You know how to release a docking collar?" Han snapped at Elagos, his hands darting over the control boards. "Yes, I think so." "Do it!" Han cut him off. "Now!" "Yes, sir." Lunging out of his seat, the Kamasi headed aft. The engines were starting to come up to power now. Han keyed the comm, setting for full frequency scan. There was going to be hell to pay for this one, all right, no matter what the Ashori thought they were doing. The sync numbers for the stabilizer he had just installed were coming in now. Seemed to be firming up. "All ships, this is New Republic President Gaversom." Gaversom's taut voice boomed from the cockpit speaker. "Stand your positions and hold your fire. Repeat, please stand down and hold your fire. The incident currently underway is not—" He never got to finish his plea. Abruptly, there was a squawk of blanketing jamming static on that frequency, drowning him out. "Attack!" a new voice bit out. "All Corellian forces, attack at will!" Han gaped at the speaker. What in blazes was the Corellian doing? And then the scan locked onto another frequency. "Attack!" a guttural Mon Calamari voice rumbled. "All Mon Cal ships, attack!" "Attack!" a Diamolan voice called calmly in their own language on another frequency. "Attack!" came the snarling Ashori reply on yet another. Han looked out at the massive ships, heart thudding in his throat. No, no, this was insane. Surely they wouldn't. But they were. All around the area, the various warships were coming sluggishly to life, heading for the better maneuverability of open sky, or else simply turning their weapons to target their opponents. And even as he watched, the first flashes of turbolaser fire began. Behind him, Elagos charged back into the cockpit. "The collar's released," he announced, breathing heavily as he resumed his seat. "We can leave." He broke off, staring in disbelief at the scene outside. "What's happened?" he gasped. "Han, what's going on?" "It's just what it looks like," Han said grimly. "The New Republic is at war." And that's the end of the chapter. Hope you enjoyed it. Talk to you soon.